In last week's history video, we talked about how we got into World War II, and now I'd like to talk a little bit about the industrialization that led to the war. This was a crucial moment in American economic history. We had come off the Great Depression, and the economy had never really recovered. And Roosevelt had inserted a whole variety of statist solutions, including public works and price fixing at the federal level and huge agricultural subsidies to try to make up for the bad economic performance, and they really hadn't worked. They'd offered relief but no recovery. So the question was, when these massive flow of new orders came in World War II, would they be handled by the government, as they basically were in World War I, or by the private sector, as they ended up being in World War II? And FDR, to his credit, and over Eleanor's opposition, brought in Knudsen from General Motors, who had been the CEO, not from General Motors, from Ford, who had been the CEO installed by Henry Ford, and who had then gone over to General Motors. And Knudsen set up this massive mobilization, gigantic mobilization, to convert the entire economy from butter to guns. Consumer goods became virtually unavailable, and no automobiles or refrigerators or any of that stuff was made, and instead it all went into war production. And essentially, Knudsen told industries, do this on a cost-plus basis, make as much money as you want. He limited it somewhat, but there was a lot of profiteering that went on. Just produce the stuff, have it come off those assembly lines, and in time for our troops to use it. And the result was this incredible, gigantic expansion of our military capability. In the final year of the war, the last full year, 1945, Germany produced something like 12,000 airplanes, Britain 7,000 or 8,000, Russia 7,000 or 8,000, and the United States 125,000. Just to give you a sense of the order of magnitude of what we're talking about. We would produce one Liberty ship a day and then several ships a day as we ramped up this capability. And this completely brought about the recovery of the American economy. And it set up the private sector in the U.S. as a vibrant, vigorous entity that took off roaring into the post-war era and set up the prosperity of the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s, set up the whole post-war dominance of the American economy. And it all originated in Franklin Roosevelt's decision to reverse the liberal dogma of a lifetime and turn the task of war production over to the private sector. Now, the other thing that's interesting about it is how we paid for the war. We paid for the war largely through taxes. The income taxes were raised to huge levels. Among the wealthy, they were essentially extortionate levels, just completely taking their entire income. And for most Americans, it was a very large tax increase. We funded about half the cost of the war with higher taxes. The other half was, in effect, taxes. It was really forced borrowing. We had the war bonds drive, and people could voluntarily choose to buy the bonds or not, but there was nothing else to spend the money on. All staples and foods and stuff were strictly rationed, and no large-scale consumer goods were available. So people bought bonds. Our savings rate rose from a norm of about 2.5% to over 17%, a level without any precedent before or since in our history. And as a result, we won the war. If you consider World War I a battle of attrition of manpower, where the 120 million Americans joining with the 80 million British and French overcame the 70 to 90 million Germans, World War II was about industrial production, and the United States' mastery in that area was just incredible. Now, in subsequent videos, in the next 2 or 3, we'll talk about the intelligence victories that permitted the United States to win the war, breaking the Axis code. We'll talk about D-Day, including some of the mistakes that were made on D-Day that caused the heavy damage at Omaha, the invasion of Europe and some of the errors that were made there and some of the successes. And finally, we'll talk about the atomic bombing of Japan at the end of the war. And then after that, we'll go back and we'll pick up at the Truman administration and continue this American history every Saturday. As I guess you know, they're archived, so you can go back and check previous lessons and lectures that you missed. Thanks a lot.